The story of utilitarianism begins in the middle of the 1700s. It starts in a time when people were thinking about law, economics, and the rights of citizens. In that era, a man named Jeremy Bentham wrote down a new way to think about right and wrong. Bentham asked a simple question: what action makes the most people happy? He called the answer the greatest happiness principle. The principle says that an action is good if it creates more pleasure and less pain for the greatest number of people. Bentham was not a monk or a king. He was a lawyer who liked to measure things. He believed that pleasure and pain could be counted like coins in a purse. He wrote that the right thing to do is the one that brings the most happiness to the most people. He summed up his idea in a short line: it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. This line is often quoted when people talk about utilitarianism. Bentham's ideas did not stay on paper for long. A younger thinker named John Stuart Mill read Bentham's work and added his own thoughts. Mill was a writer and a philosopher who lived in the early 1800s. He liked Bentham's focus on happiness, but he also saw that some pleasures are higher than others. Mill said that intellectual and moral pleasures are richer than simple bodily pleasures. He wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." This quote shows that Mill thought not all happiness is the same. Both Bentham and Mill wanted a rule that could guide governments, judges, and ordinary people. They imagined a world where laws were made to bring the most joy and the least hurt. Their work laid the foundation for modern discussions about public policy, healthcare, and even business decisions. To see the principle in action, imagine a small cake at a birthday party. There are 5 children and 1 slice of cake. If the oldest child takes the whole slice, that child feels great pleasure. But the other 4 children feel left out and sad. If the cake is cut into 5 tiny pieces, each child gets a little bit. Everyone feels some pleasure, and no one feels hurt. The greatest happiness principle would tell the party host to share the cake equally, because that choice makes more people happy overall. A second simple example comes from a school rule. Suppose a school is deciding whether to allow students to bring phones to class. If phones are allowed, some students will use them to look up information, which helps learning. But many students might also use them to play games, which distracts the class and makes the teacher's job harder. If the school bans phones, the class stays focused, but students who need a phone for a medical alert lose a safety tool. The school could ask, which rule creates the most overall happiness? If the rule that allows phones only during breaks brings the most benefit to most students while keeping lessons smooth, that rule would fit the principle. Bentham liked to turn ideas into pictures. One famous sketch shows a circular building with a central watchtower. This design is called the panopticon. In the picture, a guard in the tower can see every inmate in the surrounding cells, but the inmates cannot see the guard. Bentham said the idea was not just for prisons. He thought the panopticon could be a model for any organization that wants to keep people behaving well. The sketch is a vivid anecdote because it shows how Bentham tried to link his ideas about happiness with practical designs. He believed that if people knew they might be watched, they would act in ways that keep the group happy. Another anecdote involves Mill's essay on liberty, written in 1859. In that essay, Mill defended the right of each person to speak their mind, even if their ideas are unpopular. He argued that hearing different opinions helps society find the truth and increases overall happiness. Mill wrote, If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. This story shows how Mill connected freedom of thought with the goal of greater happiness for everyone. The core idea of utilitarianism is easy to state, but it raises tough questions. One problem is how to measure pleasure. Bentham tried to create a hedonic calculus, a list of factors such as intensity, duration, certainty, and proximity of a pleasure. He hoped that people could add up these numbers and compare different actions. In practice, however, it is hard to put a number on a smile or a feeling of grief. Different people feel things differently. A child's laughter might be short but bright, while an adult's sense of achievement may last longer. The question remains, can any system truly count happiness in a fair way? Later sections of this video will look at modern attempts to measure happiness, from surveys to brain scans, and we'll see how those tools try to answer Bentham's original challenge. A second criticism is that the greatest happiness principle can overlook the needs of minorities. If a rule makes most people happy but hurts a small group, the principle might still call the rule good. Imagine a town that decides to build a new highway. Most residents enjoy shorter travel times, but the highway cuts through a low-income neighborhood, forcing families to move. The overall happiness may rise, but the displaced families suffer a great loss. Critics say that a rule that ignores the suffering of a few can be unjust. Mill tried to soften this problem by emphasizing higher pleasures and by defending individual rights on liberty. Yet the tension between the majority's happiness and the protection of minorities stays a lively debate. The story of utilitarianism does not end with Bentham and Mill. Their ideas sparked a whole field of thought that still influences policy today. Governments use cost-benefit analysis, a modern form of the hedonic calculus, when they decide on projects like building bridges or funding health programs. Health officials weigh the number of lives saved against the money spent, trying to choose the option that brings the most well-being. In business, companies use surveys to see which product changes bring the most customer satisfaction. All of these practices echo Bentham's wish to count happiness and use that count to guide decisions. The principle also appears in everyday choices. When a family decides how to spend a weekend, they might ask, what will make everyone feel good? If they pick a picnic in the park instead of a movie that only the teenagers like, they are using a small version of the greatest happiness rule. The idea is simple. Look at who will feel better and try to pick the option that lifts the most people. To understand how the principle works, think of a simple analogy. Picture a garden with many plants. Each plant needs water, sunlight, and space to grow. If a gardener gives all the water to the tallest plant, that plant will grow big, but the smaller plants may wilt. If the gardener spreads the water evenly, most plants stay alive and the garden looks healthy. Utilitarianism asks the gardener to spread resources so that the garden as a whole thrives. The garden is like a society, and the water is like happiness. Bentham's panopticon story also serves as an analogy. The watchtower can be seen as the idea of constant awareness. When people think they might be observed, they tend to act in ways that keep the group happy. In a modern sense, this is similar to how social media can influence behavior. People post pictures that they think will bring joy to friends, hoping to increase overall happiness. The analogy shows how the principle can appear in many forms, from prison design to online sharing. Liberty anecdote offers another analogy. Think of a music concert where many bands play. If only one band is allowed to perform, The audience may miss out on new sounds. Allowing many bands gives listeners a chance to hear different styles, which can lead to a richer experience for the whole crowd. Mill's point was that hearing many voices helps society find better ideas, which in turn raises collective happiness. The greatest happiness principle also invites people to think about long-term effects. A decision that brings quick joy might cause later pain. For example, a city might lower taxes to make citizens feel richer now. But the loss of revenue could mean fewer schools and hospitals later, reducing future happiness. Utilitarianism asks decision-makers to weigh short-term pleasure against long-term well-being. This forward-looking view is part of why the principle still matters in modern debates about climate policy, where the benefits of today's choices will affect generations to come. Critics who focus on the measurement problem often bring up the idea of subjective well-being. They say that each person's feeling of happiness is private, like a secret diary. Trying to compare one diary to another is risky. Some philosophers suggest using preference satisfaction. Instead, count how many wishes are fulfilled rather than how intense the feelings are. This approach tries to avoid the problem of measuring raw pleasure. It shows that the conversation about how to count happiness is still alive, and later parts of this video will explore these newer ideas. Other critics point to the tyranny of the majority. They warn that a rule that makes most people happy can become a tool for oppression. History offers examples where majorities have used the idea of the common good to justify taking land from indigenous peoples or denying voting rights to women. Those cases remind listeners that a simple count of happiness can hide deeper issues of fairness and rights. Mill's defense of individual liberty was meant to protect against exactly this danger. The story of utilitarianism also includes a few lesser-known figures. A woman named Harriet Taylor Mill, who later married John Stuart Mill, helped shape his ideas about equality and happiness. She argued that true happiness cannot exist without justice for all. Though she is not always named in textbooks, her influence shows how the principle grew through conversation and partnership. Another contributor was Henry Sidgwick, a philosopher who wrote a book called The Methods of Ethics. He tried to sort out the different ways people think about happiness. Sidgwick's work shows that even after Bentham and Mill, thinkers kept asking how to apply the principle in real life. His careful analysis is an example of the ongoing effort to refine the idea. The principle also appears in modern technology. Artificial intelligence systems now use utility functions to decide the best action. Utility function is a math formula that tries to predict which choice will give the most benefit. In a way, this is a digital version of Bentham's calculus. Engineers program these systems to weigh outcomes, aiming for the greatest overall good. The link between 18th century philosophy and 21st century code is a striking illustration of how the idea has traveled through time. When the principle is put into practice, it can lead to policies that improve health. Public health officials often use cost-effectiveness analysis to decide which vaccines to fund. They ask, which vaccine will prevent the most illness for the least cost? The answer guides them toward the option that adds the most health and happiness to the population. This method reflects Bentham's belief that the best action is the one that produces the greatest net pleasure. Education also benefits from utilitarian thinking. Schools might choose curricula that help the most students learn essential skills. If a new math program raises test scores for many students but confuses a few, the decision may still be seen as positive if the overall gain is large. Critics, however, remind educators to look at those few students who are left behind, echoing the minority concern argument. In everyday life, the principle can help people make personal choices. A person might decide to donate part of a paycheck to charity. By giving money to those in need, the donor spreads happiness beyond their own circle. The act follows the greatest happiness rule because it adds more pleasure to the world than keeping the money for personal use. The decision feels good, and the recipients feel relief, creating a net gain in well-being. The principle also appears in law. Some legal systems use harm principle, an idea from Mill's On Liberty. The harm principle says that the only reason to limit a person's freedom is to prevent harm to others. This rule tries to protect individual happiness while keeping the group safe. It shows how Mill's ideas turned into practical guidelines for courts and governments. Bentham's panopticon sketch also inspired later thinkers who built actual prisons. The design was never fully built in Bentham's time, but the idea influenced later prison reforms. The story shows how a philosophical idea can travel into architecture and public policy. It also serves as a reminder that the goal of making people behave well for the good of all can be pursued in many ways, not just through laws, but through the design of spaces. Mill's essay On Liberty sparked debates that still echo in modern discussions about free speech on the internet. Platforms today decide whether to remove harmful content. They must balance the happiness that safe spaces bring against the loss of expression. The tension mirrors Mill's argument that open discussion leads to greater truth and happiness, while also protecting people from real damage. The greatest happiness principle also raises a question about time. Should one count only present happiness, or also future happiness? Bentham tended to add up all pleasure, past, present, and future. Mill also cared about future outcomes, especially when he talked about long-term cultural development. Modern utilitarians often use discounting, a method that gives less weight to happiness far in the future. This technique tries to reflect how people naturally value present joy more than distant joy, but it also invites debate about fairness to future generations. Another modern twist comes from the field of environmental ethics. Climate change presents a case where actions today affect the happiness of people decades from now. Utilitarian calculations that include future generations argue for strong measures now, because the total happiness saved over many years outweighs the short-term costs. This line of thinking shows how Bentham's and Mill's ideas continue to shape policy on a global scale. The principle also appears in business ethics. Companies sometimes use shareholder value as a measure of success. Critics argue that focusing only on profit ignores the happiness of workers, customers, and the community. Utilitarian approach would ask companies to consider the well-being of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. This broader view aligns with the original goal of creating the most happiness for the most people. In the realm of medicine, doctors often use quality-adjusted life years, QALYs, to decide how to allocate treatments. A QALY tries to combine length of life with quality of life, essentially putting a number on happiness. The method is a direct descendant of Bentham's desire to count pleasure. It shows how the principle can guide life-saving decisions, though it also raises the same concerns about measuring happiness and protecting vulnerable groups. The principle can be illustrated with a simple story about a playground. A town has a small park with a swing set that many children love. A developer offers to build a new shopping mall on the same land. The mall would bring jobs and tax revenue, making many adults happy. However, the children would lose their swing set and their daily joy would drop. The town council must weigh the happiness of adults against that of children. If the council chooses them all, it follows a version of the greatest happiness rule that favors the larger adult group. If it keeps the swing set, it protects the happiness of the younger, smaller group. The decision shows the tension between majority benefit and minority rights. Another story involves a hospital deciding how to allocate a limited number of organ transplants. The hospital can give an organ to a patient with a short life expectancy, or to a younger patient who may live many more years. The greatest happiness principle might suggest giving the organ to the younger patient, because the total amount of future happiness would be larger. Yet critics argue that each life has equal value, and that choosing based on expected happiness could be unfair. This real-world dilemma highlights the difficulty of turning the principle into policy. Bentham's own words help keep the discussion grounded. He wrote, "The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation." This sentence captures the core idea in a way that is easy to repeat. Mill added, "Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." Both quotes show the simple logic that underlies the whole philosophy. Look at the result and choose the result that brings the most joy. The principle also invites people to think about personal sacrifice. A person may choose to give up a night out to help a friend in need. The sacrifice reduces the person's own pleasure, but raises the friend's happiness. If the friend's gain outweighs the loss, the narrator begins by reminding the viewer that utilitarianism is a way of judging actions by the amount of happiness they create. In this part of the story, the focus is on how utilitarians try to count pleasure and pain. The idea is simple. Add up the good feelings, subtract the bad feelings, and see which option leaves the biggest net smile. This counting method is often called the hedonic calculus, but the words can be broken down into everyday language. First, imagine a family planning a movie night. Each member can give a rating from 1 to 10 for how much they expect to enjoy the film. The parents also note how long the movie will be, whether it will make anyone feel sad, and how much popcorn will be needed. If the total of all the ratings is higher than the total of any possible alternative, the family will pick that movie. In the utilitarian view, the family is doing exactly what the calculus asks. They are adding up the pleasure each person expects and choosing the option with the biggest sum. Now, picture a family vacation budget. The parents have a set amount of money. They could spend it on a beach trip, a mountain hike, or a city museum tour. For each option, they list the expected fun for each child, the chance of a bad weather day, the cost, and the time away from school. They then give each factor a simple number: a fun score, a cost score, a risk score. By adding the numbers for each plan, they can see which plan gives the most overall happiness for the least pain. The family is using the same kind of mental math that Bentham and Mill suggested. The story of how this counting idea began goes back to the 1700s. Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, liked to think of pleasure as a kind of light that could be measured. He once wrote, "The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals." Bentham imagined a kind of pleasure meter that could be turned up or down by different experiences. He even tried to design a simple table that listed things like intensity, duration, certainty, and how many people were affected. The table was meant to be a tool for judges, lawmakers, and everyday people to see which choices would bring the most joy. A second historical note comes from John Stuart Mill, who lived a few decades after Bentham. Mill liked Bentham's table, but he thought it needed a few more columns. He added ideas such as quality of pleasure and whether the pleasure is a higher or lower kind. Mill wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." In his own words, Mill tried to refine the calculus so that it would not treat all pleasures as exactly the same. He wanted the tool to be able to tell the difference between a simple pleasure like eating cake and a deeper pleasure like learning something new. Even with these early attempts, the counting idea still sounds a bit like a game. The game is to give each feeling a number, then add them up. The game works best when the feelings are easy to see, like a smile or a laugh. It gets harder when the feelings are hidden, like a quiet sense of relief after a hard decision, or when the feeling belongs to someone else. One of the first counter-arguments that people raise is the problem of comparing different people's joy. Imagine a child who loves video games and a grandparent who loves gardening. If the child rates a new game at 9 out of 10 and the grandparent rates a day in the garden at 8 out of 10, the numbers suggest the game is the better choice. But the numbers do not tell how deep the grandparent's love for gardening runs, or how much the child's excitement will fade after a few days. Some philosophers say that it is impossible to put a single scale on two very different kinds of happiness. They argue that the calculator may hide important differences in the way people experience pleasure. A second counterargument focuses on short-term versus long-term effects. A party might bring a lot of laughter right now, but it could also lead to a hangover, missed work, or a broken friendship later. A decision that looks good in the moment might cause pain weeks or months down the road. Utilitarians who use the simple add-up method can miss these delayed consequences. Critics point out that the calculus needs to include a sense of time, but measuring how much future pain or pleasure will happen is very uncertain. The longer the time horizon, the fuzzier the numbers become. To see how these problems play out, consider a real-world example from public health. A city council wants to decide whether to build a new park or a new highway. The park promises fresh air, playgrounds, and a place for families to gather. The highway promises faster travel times for commuters. The council can try to assign numbers to each benefit. The park might give each resident a small happiness boost each day, while the highway might save each commuter a few minutes each week. Adding up the numbers could show the park wins because more people use it. However, the calculation might ignore that the highway could reduce traffic accidents, or that the park could increase property values and lead to higher taxes. The difficulty of putting all these effects on the same scale is exactly what the counter-arguments warn about. A second real-world illustration comes from the world of technology. A company decides whether to launch a new app that will keep users glued to their screens for hours. The app brings immediate fun and excitement, which can be scored high on the pleasure side. But the app might also cause long-term stress, eye strain, and loss of sleep. If the company only looks at the short-term numbers, it may think the launch is a win. A more careful calculation would try to estimate the future pain and subtract it from the initial joy. The difficulty of predicting those future effects shows why the simple counting method can be tricky. Historical anecdotes help to make the ideas feel alive. One story tells of Bentham's friend, the physician James Mill, who once set up a small experiment in a garden. He gave two groups of volunteers different kinds of sweets and asked them to write down how happy they felt each hour for a whole day. He then tried to add up the scores to see which sweet gave the most lasting pleasure. The experiment showed that the sweet that gave the biggest immediate smile faded quickly, while a milder sweet kept a steady level of contentment. Bentham used the result to argue that intensity alone should not decide the best choice. Lasting pleasure matters too. Another anecdote comes from Mill's own life. As a teenager, Mill spent many hours reading poetry and debating with friends. He later recalled that the deep satisfaction he felt from a good argument stayed with him long after the debate ended. He wrote, "The pleasures of the mind are of a higher order than those of the body." This personal memory helped him shape his refinement of the calculus, adding a column for higher pleasures. The story shows how a thinker's own experience can shape a philosophical tool. The core idea that runs through all these stories is that utilitarianism wants a clear way to see which actions bring the most happiness. The counting method, or hedonic calculus, is the tool that tries to do that. It asks people to think about intensity, how long the feeling lasts, how certain it is, and who is affected. It also asks people to think about pain in the same way. By putting numbers on each factor, the method hopes to turn a messy moral choice into a simple arithmetic problem. The next part of the video will look at another set of critiques. Some philosophers say that instead of counting every little feeling, it may be better to follow rules that usually lead to good outcomes. They argue that a rule-based approach can avoid the trouble of trying to compare each person's joy or predict the far future. The story will move from the calculator to the rulebook, showing how the debate continues. In summary, utilitarians try to count pleasure and pain by giving each feeling a simple score. Historical experiments with sweets and personal reflections on poetry helped shape the early tools. The method works well for easy choices like a movie night or a vacation budget, but it meets trouble when different people's joys must be compared or when short-term fun hides long-term hurt. These challenges set the stage for the next discussion about rule-based critiques. The journey from counting happiness to following rules keeps the conversation alive, and the viewer is invited to keep watching as the story unfolds. The story of utilitarianism began in the late 18th century, when a lawyer named Jeremy Bentham wrote that the right thing to do is the one that creates the most happiness for the most people. Bentham called this the greatest happiness principle. He wrote that pleasure and pain are the two forces that move human life. In his own words, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Bentham's idea spread quickly, and by the early 19th century, a group of thinkers in England started to argue about how to apply the principle in real life. One of those thinkers was John Stuart Mill, a young philosopher who grew up in a household that read Bentham's work every day. Mill added a new layer to the principle. He said that not only the amount of pleasure matters, but also the quality of that pleasure. He wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Mill's version of the principle made it feel more refined, but it also opened a new debate. The debate was about whether each single act should be judged on its own, or whether people should follow rules that have been shown to bring the most happiness overall. The first camp in this debate became known as act utilitarianism. Act utilitarians say that every action should be measured by the amount of happiness it creates in that moment. If a person tells a small lie that saves a friend's feelings, an act utilitarian would count the happiness the lie brings and compare it to the unhappiness caused by breaking the truth. If the balance is positive, the lie is the right thing to do. Utilitarianism looks at each case as a fresh puzzle, and it tries to solve the puzzle by adding up the good and the bad. The second camp became known as rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarians say that instead of judging each act on its own, people should follow rules that have been tested and shown to bring the most happiness in the long run. A rule that says, always tell the truth, might be a rule that, on average, creates more trust, more cooperation, and more happiness than a world where people lie whenever they think it helps. Rule utilitarians argue that the overall picture matters more than the single moment. To see how these two ideas work, imagine a simple everyday scene. A child asks a parent whether a birthday present is hidden under the couch. The truth is that the present is hidden in a closet, but the child looks scared. An act utilitarian would ask, does telling the truth now cause the child distress? Does a small lie that says, yes, it's under the couch, keep the child calm and happy? If the lie brings more happiness in that moment, the act utilitarian would say the lie is the right choice. The act is judged alone, and the outcome is measured by the pleasure and pain that follow, just as described in the measurement section. Now picture a driver who sees a shortcut through a quiet residential street. The shortcut will save 5 minutes, but it also adds noise and danger to a neighborhood that is normally calm. An act utilitarian would weigh the driver's saved time and reduced stress against the extra risk and annoyance to the neighbors. If the saved time brings more happiness than the extra noise causes unhappiness, the act utilitarian would say the driver should take the shortcut. The decision is made by looking at the direct consequences of that single act. A rule utilitarian would handle both scenes differently. In the first scene, the rule always tell the truth would be applied. The rule is judged not by the single moment, but by the long-term effect of having a culture where truth is trusted. Even if a small lie makes a child feel better now, the rule says that the overall trust built by always telling the truth creates more happiness over time. The driver's case would be judged by a rule such as, do not drive through residential streets unless necessary. The rule is chosen because, in the long run, keeping neighborhoods quiet and safe builds a sense of community, which brings more overall happiness than a few minutes saved by a few drivers. Both sides have strong arguments. Act utilitarianism is praised for its flexibility. It can adapt to unusual situations where a rule might seem too harsh. For example, during a wartime evacuation, a soldier might need to break a rule about keeping quiet in order to warn civilians of danger. An act utilitarian can say that the immediate saving of lives outweighs the rule about silence. This flexibility makes act utilitarianism feel very responsive to the real world. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, is praised for its stability. It offers clear guidance that people can learn and follow without having to calculate happiness every time they act. A rule that says, don't steal, gives a simple, reliable direction that helps society run smoothly. The rule creates trust, reduces conflict, and makes it easier for people to plan their lives. In the traffic shortcut example, a rule that discourages shortcuts through neighborhoods can keep traffic predictable and reduce accidents, even if on a rare occasion a shortcut might seem harmless. Critics of rule utilitarianism raise the problem of rule rigidity. A rule can become so strict that it blocks actions that would clearly improve happiness in a particular case. Imagine a hospital where a rule says, never lie to patients. If a doctor knows that a patient's condition is terminal and that a small lie about the prognosis would keep the patient calm and allow them to enjoy their remaining days, the rule still forces the doctor to tell the harsh truth. The rule's inflexibility can cause unnecessary suffering. This criticism points out that rules, once set, may not adapt quickly enough to special circumstances. Another criticism focuses on the potential for rule abuse. Because rule utilitarianism relies on general rules, people might try to craft rules that serve their own interests, while claiming they promote overall happiness. A powerful group could argue that a rule allowing greater surveillance for safety will increase happiness by reducing crime, while actually using it to control dissent. The rule looks good in theory, but in practice it can be twisted to serve narrow goals. This shows how a rule that is meant to bring the most happiness can be misused if the measurement of outcomes is biased or incomplete. The measurement of outcomes, as explained earlier, depends on adding up pleasure and subtracting pain. Act utilitarians often use a quick mental tally. They ask, what pleasure does this action bring? What pain does it cause? They try to count the units of happiness for each person affected. Rule utilitarians use a broader view. They look at long-term data, statistics, and trends to see how a rule has performed over time. They might examine crime rates, health outcomes, or levels of trust in a community. Both methods aim to follow the same principle, but they differ in the time span and scope they consider. Historical anecdotes help illustrate how the debate unfolded. In the 1840s, a group of British reformers gathered to discuss a new law that would allow poor children to work longer hours in factories. Bentham's followers argued that the extra income would increase the family's happiness, while others warned that the loss of childhood and health would cause more pain. Mill entered the discussion and argued that a rule protecting child labor limits would, over time, create a healthier, more educated population, leading to greater overall happiness. The debate showed early on how act-focused calculations could clash with rule-focused thinking. Another anecdote comes from the early 20th century, when a famous American philosopher, William James, faced a dilemma about whether to tell a friend a comforting lie about a lost job. James, who was influenced by both utilitarian ideas and pragmatism, decided that the lie was acceptable because it prevented immediate despair. However, he later reflected that if everyone adopted a rule of always protect friends from bad news, trust would erode and cause more suffering. James' personal struggle mirrors the tension between judging each act and following a stable rule. Modern interpretations keep the conversation alive. In contemporary bioethics, act utilitarianism appears when doctors consider whether to allocate a single life-saving organ to a patient with a higher chance of recovery, even if a rule says first come, first served. Rule utilitarianism shows up in public policy, such as traffic laws that ban speeding in residential areas. The rule is kept even though a driver might sometimes save time by speeding, because the overall safety benefits outweigh the occasional inconvenience. Artificial intelligence research also brings new angles. An AI programmed to follow act utilitarian calculations might evaluate each decision in real time, trying to maximize happiness with each move. Critics warn that such a system could make unpredictable choices, like lying to a user if it thinks the lie will keep the user calm. A rule-based AI, on the other hand, would follow a set of programmed guidelines, such as never deceive a user, even if a short-term lie could reduce distress. The debate about how to program machines echoes the old act versus rule discussion. Analogies help make the ideas clearer. Think of a gardener who decides whether to water a single plant more than usual. An act gardener looks at that plant alone, sees it wilting, and adds extra water, judging the result by the plant's health that day. A rule gardener follows a schedule that says water each plant twice a week. The schedule was created because, over many seasons, it gave the garden the best overall yield. The act gardener may help a single plant thrive, but the rule gardener keeps the whole garden balanced. The garden analogy shows why some people prefer one method over the other. Another analogy uses a game of chess. In a single move, a player might sacrifice a piece to gain a quick advantage. That move is judged by its immediate effect on the board. A rule-oriented player might follow a strategy that says, never sacrifice a queen unless the opponent's king is in check. The rule is based on many past games where losing a queen early led to defeat. Both approaches aim to win, but one looks at the moment, the other at the pattern. The conversation between act and rule utilitarianism is not just academic. It shows up in everyday choices. When a teenager decides whether to cheat on a test, an act utilitarian might ask whether the cheat will bring more happiness than the risk of getting caught. A rule utilitarian would consider the rule cheating is wrong, because, over time, a culture of honesty creates trust in schools and workplaces. The teen's decision reflects the tension between immediate benefit and long-term rule. In the workplace, managers often face a similar split. A manager might think about giving a bonus to a single employee who worked extra hours. An act calculation would weigh the employee's happiness against the cost to the company. A rule approach would follow a policy that says bonuses are given based on team performance, because that rule encourages cooperation and fairness, which over time builds a happier workplace. Both sides have tried to answer the criticism that measuring happiness is impossible. Bentham suggested using a hedonic calculus, a list of factors such as intensity, duration, certainty, and proximity of pleasure or pain. Mill added that the quality of pleasures matters too. Act utilitarians often apply this list to each decision, while rule utilitarians apply it to the outcomes of whole policies. Critics still point out that numbers can never capture the full richness of human experience, but the attempt to be systematic keeps the debate grounded. The split between act and rule also appears in legal theory. Some scholars argue that law should be built on act utilitarian principles, judging each case by its consequences. Others say that law should be based on stable rules that have proven to promote the common good. The famous case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens, where shipwrecked sailors killed a cabin boy to survive, sparked a rule-focused response. The law declared that killing is never justified, even in dire circumstances, to protect the value of human life. This rule protects society, even if in that single act, the sailors thought they were increasing overall happiness. A modern example comes from environmental policy. A city may consider allowing a factory to emit extra smoke for a short period to boost production and lower product prices. An act utilitarian might calculate that the temporary boost in jobs and cheaper goods outweighs the shorter-term air pollution. A rule utilitarian would look at the rule limit emissions to protect public health, which over many years leads to cleaner air, lower health costs, and higher overall happiness. The city's decision reflects the tension between a one-off gain and a lasting rule. The debate has also moved into the realm of animal ethics. Act utilitarians might argue that using a single animal for a medical test is justified if it leads to a cure that saves many lives. Rule utilitarians might support a rule that bans animal testing, except in emergencies, because the rule respects animal welfare and builds public trust in science. The two approaches illustrate how the same principle can lead to different policies depending on whether the focus is on each act or on the rule that guides many acts. Historical records show that the split was not always clear. In the 1860s, a group of utilitarians in England met to discuss the Great Reform Act. Some argued for a rule that gave all men the right to vote, believing that a stable rule would increase political participation and happiness. Others argued that each constituency should be examined individually, allowing for special cases where a different rule might work better. The meeting ended with a compromise, a general rule with provisions for local adjustments. This compromise foreshadows modern hybrid approaches that try to blend Act flexibility with rule stability. A later moment came in the early 20th century when a philosopher named G.E. Moore criticized pure Act utilitarianism for ignoring the importance of moral rules. Moore argued that some actions are wrong even if they seem to increase happiness, because they violate a deeper moral principle. Moore's critique pushed rule utilitarians to sharpen their arguments and to show that rules can be justified by the happiness they produce over time. In recent years, scholars have proposed two-level utilitarianism, a hybrid that tries to get the best of both worlds. The idea is to use simple rules for most everyday decisions, but to allow Act-style calculations in rare, unusual cases. This approach mirrors how people actually think. They follow habits and norms, but they also pause to think when something strange happens. The hybrid model shows that the Act versus rule split is not an either-or, but a spectrum where different tools are useful at different times. The two everyday scenarios introduced earlier help illustrate this hybrid view. In the white lie case, a person might follow the rule, tell the truth, but pause to consider whether the lie would prevent a serious emotional crisis. If the crisis is severe, the person might temporarily set aside the rule and act in a way that creates more happiness in that moment. In the traffic shortcut case, a driver might follow the rule, stay on main roads, but notice that the main road is blocked by an accident. The driver could then take the shortcut, judging that the short-term benefit outweighs the rule because the rule's purpose, smooth traffic, cannot be met at that moment. The hybrid model captures the balance between consistency and responsiveness. Real applications of these ideas are already visible. In public health, vaccination policies often follow a rule utilitarian approach. Everyone should be vaccinated unless there is a medical exemption. The rule is based on data showing that high vaccination rates keep diseases low, creating more overall happiness. Yet, in a rare outbreak of a new disease, health officials might use an Act-style calculation to decide whether to temporarily suspend certain rights for a short period, such as imposing a quarantine on a specific neighborhood. The decision blends rule guidance with Act flexibility. In education, schools adopt a rule that students must complete homework on time. The rule builds discipline and prepares students for future responsibilities, which over time leads to better outcomes. However, a teacher may sometimes give an extension when a student faces a family emergency. The teacher's Act decision considers the immediate suffering of the student and the overall benefit of keeping the student's morale high. The practice shows how rules guide daily life, while Act judgments allow compassion. Modern philosophers continue to refine the ideas. Some argue that rule utilitarianism should be based on idealized rules that assume people act rationally and with full information. Others say that rules should be empirically tested, meaning that societies should collect data on how rules affect happiness and adjust them when needed. The measurement section's tools, surveys, well-being indexes, and statistical models make it possible to test rules in ways Bentham could only imagine. The discussion now turns to the clash between the idea of maximizing happiness and the idea that each person has a set of rights that must never be broken. This clash is called the critique from rights theory. It began long before the word utilitarianism was popular. The first big voice was Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who lived in the 1700s. Kant argued that moral rules are not based on outcomes, but on a law that each rational person can see as universal. He wrote, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." In plain words, if an action cannot be turned into a rule that everyone could follow, then it is not moral. For Kant, a promise is a perfect example. If a promise is broken whenever it would bring more happiness, then the rule "keep promises" would disappear, and trust would crumble. That is why Kant said that breaking a promise is always wrong, no matter how good the result might look. Modern rights advocates have taken Kant's idea and turned it into a living set of claims about what each person deserves. Thinkers such as John Rawls, who wrote about justice as fairness, and contemporary lawyers who defend civil liberties, argue that rights are not just nice ideas, but firm protections. Rawls said that a just society is one in which each person's basic liberties are protected, even if giving up those liberties could increase overall welfare. In the United States, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s gave a vivid picture of this clash. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice, but they also insisted that the law must protect the rights of the oppressed, not just count the number of happy people. A simple story can show the tension. Imagine a student named Maya, who promised her friend to keep a secret about a surprise birthday party. The school principal learns that a fire alarm will go off later that day, and the alarm will cause a panic that could hurt many students. The principal asks Maya to break her promise and tell the teachers about the fire drill so that they can stop it. From a utilitarian point of view, breaking the promise could prevent a larger disaster and thus produce more happiness. From a rights-based view, Maya's promise is a personal right that should not be broken, because promises create trust. The question becomes, should Maya keep her promise even if breaking it could save many people? The rights theory says yes, because the right to keep a promise is itself a rule that protects social stability. A second case deals with a minority student named Luis, who is the only one in his class who speaks Spanish at home. The school wants to start a new after-school program that will help the majority of students improve their math scores. The program will take up the only available classroom, leaving no room for a Spanish language club. Utilitarian might argue that the math program will raise test scores for most students, creating more overall happiness. A rights-focused thinker would argue that Luis has a right to cultural expression and language support, and that the school must protect that right, even if it means fewer math points for the majority. The rights view says that protecting the minority's cultural rights is essential for a fair society. Kant's own letters give a glimpse of how seriously he took the idea of a universal moral law. In a letter to his friend Johann Gottfried von Herder, Kant wrote that the law of reason must be obeyed even when it brings personal loss. He described a situation where a merchant could cheat a customer to make more profit, but the merchant must refuse because the rule, "do not cheat," must hold for everyone. Kant's tone was calm but firm. He believed that the moral law was like a compass that never wavers, no matter how tempting the short-term gain. This personal correspondence shows that Kant's ideas were not abstract theory alone. They were meant to guide everyday choices. A second historical anecdote comes from the civil rights debates of the 1960s. When the Supreme Court heard the case of Brown v. Board of Education, the justices argued that segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Some economists at the time suggested that integrating schools might cause short-term unrest and lower test scores, which could hurt overall happiness. Yet the justices held that the right to equal education could not be sacrificed for a temporary increase in utility. The decision showed that the court saw rights as a higher rule that protects each person's dignity, even when the numbers might suggest a different choice. The case is often quoted by rights theorists as a clear example of why rights must stand on their own. Critics of utilitarianism say that the theory can easily slide into an ends justify the means mindset. They argue that if the goal is always to produce the most happiness, then any action, even the most harmful, could be allowed if it creates a larger net gain. This is why rights theorists stress that some actions are off limits, no matter the outcome. They point to the promise example and the minority student example as proof that a rule that protects rights is needed to keep society stable. If promises could be broken whenever the numbers look good, then trust would erode, and the very foundation for cooperation would disappear. Supporters of utilitarianism have responded with two main counterarguments. The first says that utilitarianism is not a rigid formula. It can be flexible enough to protect rights when those rights lead to greater happiness in the long run. For instance, keeping promises builds trust, which in turn makes future cooperation easier and more beneficial. The utilitarian could argue that respecting the right to keep a promise is a rule that usually produces the most happiness, so the theory can incorporate the right as a useful guideline. This version of utilitarianism is called rule utilitarianism. It says that we should follow the rules that, if everyone followed them, would create the greatest overall good. In this view, the right to keep promises becomes a rule that a utilitarian would endorse because it tends to increase happiness over time. The second counter-argument says that rights can be understood as rules that already aim to promote happiness. When a society declares that everyone has a right to free speech, it is really saying that free speech leads to a more informed public, which makes better decisions and thus more happiness. In this sense, rights are not opposed to utilitarian goals. They are tools that help reach those goals. A rights theorist who accepts this view might still argue that the rule should not be broken because breaking it would undermine the very tool that creates happiness. This argument tries to bridge the gap by showing that rights and utility can work together rather than fight each other. Rule utilitarianism, the version that focuses on following the best rules, fits neatly into this discussion. It says that the right thing to do is the rule that would bring the most happiness if everyone followed it. The promise case fits this model. The rule keep promises generally leads to trust, which helps people work together and feel safe. The minority student case also fits. The rule, protect cultural rights, helps a diverse society function, which creates more overall well-being. By looking at the bigger picture, rule utilitarianism can defend many of the rights that critics say are off limits to classical act-be-act utilitarianism. To see how this plays out in everyday life, imagine a city council that must decide whether to build a new highway that will cut through a low-income neighborhood. The highway would reduce traffic for thousands of commuters, creating a lot of happiness. At the same time, it would displace families and break their right to a stable home. A rights-focused approach would say the displacement is unacceptable, regardless of the traffic benefits. A rule utilitarian approach would ask whether a rule that protects homes from being destroyed for public projects generally leads to more happiness. If the answer is yes, then the council should look for another solution, such as improving public transport, that respects the right while still easing traffic. This example shows how the two perspectives can meet in a practical decision. Another modern illustration comes from the world of technology. A social media platform wants to use personal data to show users ads that match their interests, which would increase user satisfaction and company profit. Some users argue that they have a right to privacy, and that their data should not be used without explicit consent. A strict utilitarian might say that the overall happiness from better ads outweighs the small inconvenience of data use. A rights advocate would say that privacy is a fundamental right that must not be ignored. A rule utilitarian could argue that a rule obtain clear consent before using personal data usually leads to higher trust and long-term happiness, so the platform should follow that rule even if it means fewer short-term gains. The conversation between rights theory and utilitarianism is not just academic. It shapes laws, policies, and personal choices. When lawmakers write a law that bans hate speech, they are protecting a right to safety and dignity. Utilitarians might support the ban if they see that hate speech lowers overall happiness. When a doctor decides whether to give a risky experimental treatment that could save many lives but might harm a few patients, the doctor must weigh the right of each patient to be safe against the potential happiness of many. These real-world moments show why the clash matters. Kant's letters also reveal his belief that moral law is something that can be taught and learned. He wrote to a student that the moral law is not a command that can be ignored when convenient. It is a principle that guides the soul. This idea helped later thinkers develop the notion of human rights as something that can be taught in schools and built into constitutions. The civil rights activists of the 1960s used similar language, insisting that rights are not gifts from the state, but inherent in every person. Their speeches often quoted the Constitution, saying that all men are created equal, a phrase that echoes the idea of a universal moral law. In the same era, a philosopher named Robert Nozick wrote a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He argued that the state should only protect people's rights and not try to redistribute wealth for the sake of overall happiness. Nozick's view is a modern version of the rights critique. He said, "If a person's liberty is taken away for the sake of a greater good, the act is a violation of that person's rights." This quote captures the core of the rights objection, that using people as means to an end, even a happy end, is morally wrong. The debate also appears in popular culture. In a well-known movie, a hero must decide whether to sacrifice a few innocent lives to stop a villain who would cause widespread suffering. The hero's choice reflects the tension between a utilitarian calculation and a rights-based refusal to treat people as mere numbers. Audiences often feel uneasy when the hero chooses the utilitarian path, because it seems to ignore the dignity of each character. This reaction shows that many people have an intuitive sense that rights matter, even when the numbers suggest another answer. To bring the discussion back to the core idea of utilitarianism, remember that the theory started with the simple claim that the best action is the one that brings the most happiness. Early thinkers like Jeremy Bentham wrote, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." Bentham also spoke of the greatest happiness principle in plain language, saying that we should count pleasure and pain like we count coins. However, the rights critique points out that counting can miss the fact that some coins are special. A promise, a cultural right, a personal liberty. These are not just numbers, they are parts of what makes life worth living. When the two sides meet, a possible middle ground is to treat rights as rules that have been shown to produce the most happiness when followed. This is the essence of rule utilitarianism. It does not deny that sometimes a strict calculation might suggest breaking a rule, but it argues that the long-term pattern of following the rule is better for everyone. The promise case and the minority student case both illustrate how a rule that protects rights can also lift overall well-being. By focusing on the pattern rather than each single act, rule utilitarianism offers a way to respect rights while staying true to the goal of happiness. The story of the civil rights movement also offers a lesson about how rights can become part of a rule that benefits society. When the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, it set a rule that everyone must be treated equally in public schools. This rule helped to reduce racial tension and increased social cohesion, which in turn raised the overall happiness of the nation. The decision shows that a rule protecting a right can have a ripple effect that aligns with the utilitarian aim of more happiness. In the modern world, new rights are being debated, such as the right to digital privacy, the right to a clean environment, and the right to access healthcare. Each of these claims can be examined through the lens of both rights theory and utilitarianism. A rights theorist would say that these are fundamental claims that must be honored regardless of the cost. Utilitarian would ask whether granting the right leads to greater happiness for the majority. A rule utilitarian would look for a rule that protects the right while also promoting the greatest good. This three-way view helps policymakers think more clearly about complex issues. One more anecdote helps to illustrate how the clash plays out in everyday life. In the 1930s, a small town in the Midwest faced a drought that threatened the crops of many farmers. The town council considered forcing a few landowners to sell their water rights to the community, arguing that the extra water would feed many families and increase overall happiness. The landowners objected, saying that their right to own and use their water could not be taken away. The council eventually chose a compromise. They created a rule that water could be shared in emergencies, but only with the consent of the owners. This rule respected the owners' rights, while also addressing the community's need, showing a practical blend of rights protection and utilitarian concern. The conversation between rights theory and utilitarianism is ongoing. New philosophers continue to write about how to balance the two. Some suggest that rights should be seen as negative duties, meaning we must not harm others, while utilitarianism focuses on positive duties, meaning we should do things that help. Others argue that the distinction is not useful, because any duty that respects a person's autonomy also tends to increase happiness. The debate remains lively in classrooms, courts, and boardrooms. In summary, the critique from rights theory asks whether a simple tally of pleasure and pain can ever be enough to guide moral choices. It points to promises, cultural protections, and personal liberties as examples of things that should not be sacrificed for a larger sum of happiness. Kant's early letters, the civil rights battles of the 20th century, and modern legal cases all show that rights have a powerful hold on moral thinking. At the same time, utilitarian thinkers have offered two ways to answer the critique. First, they argue that a flexible, rule-based form of utilitarianism can protect rights because the best rules are those that keep trust and dignity intact. Second, they argue that rights themselves are rules that have been shown to promote happiness, so protecting them is not a contradiction, but a reinforcement of the utilitarian goal. By looking at real cases, historical anecdotes, and clear quotes, the discussion makes clear that the clash is not a dead end, but a chance to shape a moral system that respects both happiness and the worth of each individual. The idea of fairness sits at the heart of many moral debates. In the world of utilitarian thought, fairness is often measured by the amount of happiness or pain that a decision creates. The classic phrase, "the greatest happiness for the greatest number," comes from Jeremy Bentham, the founder of modern utilitarianism. Bentham wrote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure." For Bentham, the right action is the one that produces the most pleasure and the least pain for everyone involved. John Stuart Mill later refined the idea. He said, "Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." Mill added that happiness is not just a fleeting feeling, but a deeper sense of well-being. He also tried to protect individual rights, warning that a society that only counts numbers could crush a single voice. Mill's words set the stage for the clash between pure utility and the sense that each person deserves a fair share. The question of fairness becomes sharper when real-life examples are added. Imagine a group of 4 friends sharing a pizza. The pizza has 8 slices. Utilitarian might ask, what division will make the total happiness highest? If one friend loves cheese more than the others, giving that friend 3 slices could raise the group's total pleasure. The other 3 friends each get 1 slice, and the total happiness might be higher than a perfectly even split where each gets 2 slices. The utilitarian answer says the best outcome is the one that adds up to the most pleasure, even if it looks unfair to the friends who get less. Now picture a school that must decide how to spend a limited budget. The school could buy new computers for the science lab, or it could add more counselors to help students with mental health. Utilitarian calculation would try to estimate which choice brings more overall well-being to the student body. If the counselors reduce stress for many students, the utilitarian might favor them. If the computers boost learning for a large number of students, that could be the better choice. In both cases, the decision is guided by the sum of happiness, not by a rule that each student gets the same amount of resources. These simple pictures hide a deeper tension. Critics say that focusing only on total happiness can lead to unfair outcomes. A classic counterargument points out that a decision that makes most people a little happier can still leave a minority badly off. In the pizza story, the friend who receives only 1 slice might feel cheated, even though the group as a whole smiles more. In the school story, a group of students might miss out on needed support if the budget goes to a different project. The criticism argues that fairness itself can raise overall happiness because people feel respected and valued when they get a fair share. John Rawls offers a different view of fairness. In his book, A Theory of Justice, Rawls wrote, "Justice is the first virtue of social institutions." He imagined an original position where people choose the rules of society behind a veil of ignorance. This veil hides each person's wealth, talent, and status, so the rules must be fair to everyone, not just to the majority. Rawls proposed 2 principles. First, each person should have as much basic liberty as possible. Second, social and economic inequalities are acceptable only if they benefit the least advantaged. This second principle is called the difference principle. Rawls' ideas stand in contrast to pure utilitarianism because they start with fairness, not with total happiness. The historical development of welfare policies in the early 1900s shows how societies tried to balance utility and fairness. In Britain, the Liberal government passed the Old Age Pensions Act of 1908. The law gave a small pension to all citizens over 70, regardless of income. The aim was to reduce suffering among the elderly, a clear utilitarian motive. Yet the policy also reflected a sense of fairness. Every old person received the same basic support. In the United States, the New Deal of the 1930s created Social Security. The program promised a regular payment to retired workers. The goal was to lift many out of poverty, increasing overall well-being. At the same time, the program treated all eligible workers the same, showing a concern for equal treatment. These historical moves illustrate that governments often mix the two ideas. They try to raise the total amount of happiness, while also giving each person a minimum level of security. The mix can be seen as a practical response to the criticism that pure utility can be unfair. By setting a floor, societies protect the most vulnerable, which Rawls would call the least advantaged. Modern philosophers have tried to bring fairness back into utilitarian thinking. Suggest a rule utilitarianism where the rule itself, not each single act, is judged by its overall consequences. A rule that says always treat people equally when sharing food might produce more happiness in the long run because it builds trust. Others propose preference utilitarianism, which counts the satisfaction of each person's preferences, not just pleasure. If a person prefers a fair share over a larger share, the calculation respects the preference, making the outcome feel more just. A second counter-argument says that fairness can actually increase total happiness. When people see that a system treats them fairly, they are more likely to cooperate and contribute. In the pizza example, if the friends agree beforehand on an equal split, the act of sharing equally may bring more joy than a calculated uneven split, even if the total slices are the same. In the school example, a policy that allocates resources equally among classes can boost morale among teachers and students, leading to better performance and higher overall satisfaction. This view holds that fairness is not a side effect, but a source of happiness. The measurement problem also looms large. Utilitarianism relies on the ability to measure pleasure and pain, or happiness and suffering. In practice, it is hard to put a number on a feeling. Psychologists use surveys and scales, but these tools are imperfect. Rawls sidestepped the measurement issue by focusing on rights and principles instead of numbers. He argued that a just society should guarantee certain basic freedoms, regardless of how they affect overall happiness. This rights-based approach offers a safeguard against the risk of sacrificing a few for the many. One quote from Bentham captures the measurement challenge. "The greatest happiness principle is a principle of calculation." The word calculation hints at the need for some kind of accounting. Mill added, "It is not the happiness of the many that makes it good, but the happiness of each." This sentence reminds listeners that each person's happiness matters, not just the sum. Another historical anecdote comes from the early welfare state in Germany. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduced health insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, and old age pensions in 1889. Bismarck's policies aimed to reduce social unrest and improve workers' health, a utilitarian goal. Yet the laws applied to all workers, showing a fairness principle. The German model inspired many later welfare programs, showing how utility and fairness can travel together. A modern example of fairness in policy can be seen in the way some cities allocate public park space. The city council might use a formula that gives each neighborhood a minimum amount of green area per resident. The formula also adds extra space for neighborhoods with higher population density. This approach tries to raise overall well-being by giving everyone a basic level of access, while also acknowledging that more people need more space. The policy reflects both utilitarian and Rawlsian ideas. The discussion of justice and fairness also brings up the idea of rights. Critics of utilitarianism argue that rights protect individuals from being sacrificed for the greater good. A right to free speech, for instance, does not disappear even if silencing a few voices would make most people happier. Rawls built his theory on the idea of inviolable rights, which he called basic liberties. He claimed that any social arrangement that violates these liberties cannot be just, no matter how much overall happiness it creates. In response, some utilitarians claim that respecting rights usually leads to more happiness in the long run. They argue that a society that protects free speech, for example, encourages creativity and innovation, which raises overall well-being. This view tries to show that rights and utility can work together, rather than being in conflict. The tension between fairness and utility can be illustrated with a simple analogy. Think of a garden with many plants. A gardener who only counts the total amount of fruit might cut down the small, slow-growing plants to give more water to the big trees. The total fruit may rise, but the garden loses diversity. A gardener who cares about fairness waters each plant equally, keeping the garden balanced. The total fruit may be lower, but the garden stays healthy and resilient. The analogy shows how a focus on total output can ignore the value of each individual part. Another analogy uses a classroom. A teacher can give extra help to the students who are already doing well, raising the class average test score. The overall performance improves, but the struggling students fall further behind. If the teacher instead spends time with the students who need the most help, the class average may stay the same, but the gap narrows. The second choice feels fair and may keep the classroom a better place for learning. The analogy mirrors the Rawlsian difference principle, which says that inequalities are acceptable only if they help the worst off. The conversation about justice and fairness also touches on the idea of collective responsibility. When a society decides to fund a public health program, the cost is shared among all taxpayers. A pure utilitarian view would support the program if it saves more lives than it costs. A fairness view would ask whether the burden falls equally on rich and poor. If the tax system is progressive, the rich pay more, which can be seen as fair because they have more ability to pay. This blend of utility and fairness appears in many modern tax policies. In the realm of technology, the fairness debate resurfaces with algorithms that allocate resources. An app that assigns rides to drivers might aim to maximize total trips completed. If the algorithm always sends rides to drivers in busy areas, those drivers earn more, but drivers in quieter neighborhoods get few trips. The total number of rides rises, but the system feels unfair to some drivers. Designers can add a fairness constraint that ensures each driver receives a minimum number of rides. This adjustment may lower the total number of rides a little, but it improves driver satisfaction and reduces turnover, which can ultimately raise overall happiness. The measurement issue also appears in climate policy. Utilitarian might calculate the total economic benefit of building a new coal plant versus the total health cost from pollution. If the economic gain outweighs the health loss, the plant would be built. A fairness perspective would ask whether the health costs fall mainly on a vulnerable community. If they do, the policy may be judged unjust, even if the numbers suggest a net gain. Rawls would argue that the policy should be arranged to protect the least advantaged, perhaps by requiring cleaner technology or compensation. Rawls' own words help keep the discussion grounded. He wrote, "Justice as fairness is the view that the principles of justice are those that free and equal persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an original position." The phrase free and equal persons highlights that each individual counts, not just the sum of everyone's happiness. This idea pushes back against a calculation that could ignore a single person's suffering. Modern philosophers such as Amartya Sen have taken up the challenge of linking utility and fairness. Sen introduced the concept of capabilities, which looks at what people are actually able to do and be. He argued that a society should expand each person's real freedoms, not just add up pleasure. This approach blends the utilitarian focus on outcomes with the Rawlsian focus on individual rights and capabilities. The debate also appears in legal theory. In court cases about discrimination, a utilitarian argument might say that allowing a small group to receive special treatment could increase overall social harmony. A fairness argument would say that the law must treat everyone the same, regardless of the possible happiness gain. The U.S. Supreme Court often balances these concerns, sometimes using a strict scrutiny test that protects minority rights, even if the outcome reduces overall utility. One more historical note involves the development of the welfare state in Scandinavia after World War I. Countries such as Sweden built extensive healthcare, education, and unemployment benefits. The goal was to raise the average standard of living, a clear utilitarian aim. At the same time, the policies guaranteed a minimum level of services for every citizen, reflecting a fairness principle. The success of these systems is often cited as evidence that utility and fairness can reinforce each other. In practice, many policies try to find a sweet spot. A city might set a rule that every neighborhood gets at least one public library. The rule respects fairness. The city also decides to place larger libraries in areas with more readers, which raises total reading time and overall happiness. The combination shows how a fair baseline can be paired with a utility-driven adjustment. The conversation about justice and fairness in utilitarianism is far from settled. Some philosophers argue that fairness is a separate moral value that must be weighed alongside utility. Others claim that fairness is simply a tool that helps achieve the greatest happiness in the long run. The debate continues in academic journals, policy debates, and everyday conversations. What matters for listeners is the practical impact. When a decision maker asks, "Will this choice make the most people happy?" they should also ask, "Will the choice treat each person with respect?" The two questions can lead to different answers. The pizza example shows that a small sacrifice of fairness can raise total pleasure, but the friends may feel less trust. The school example shows that a fair allocation can build a sense of community, which may boost learning over time. In the end, the story of justice and fairness in utilitarianism reminds that numbers alone do not capture the whole moral picture. A balanced view looks at both the total amount of happiness and the way that happiness is shared. The ideas of Bentham and Mill provide a powerful tool for measuring outcomes. The ideas of Rawls, Sen, and modern policymakers add a reminder that each person deserves a fair chance. By listening to both sides, societies can craft rules that aim for the greatest good while keeping the promise of fairness. The final thought ties back to the core of the discussion. A society that cares only about the sum of happiness risks leaving some people behind. A society that cares only about equal shares may miss opportunities to lift overall well-being. The challenge is to blend the two, to let fairness guide the way utility is applied. As the narrator of this story, the gentle voice reminds listeners that the path to a good life is not just about counting smiles, but also about making sure every smile feels earned. The practical side of utilitarian thinking shows up every day in the choices that governments, hospitals, and companies make. In the earlier part of the video, the idea of measuring happiness was explained, and the link between that measure and the idea of justice was explored. Now the focus turns to how those ideas guide real-world decisions. Public policy provides the clearest view of utilitarian ideas at work. When a city decides how to spend a limited budget, the goal is often to create the most good for the most people. In the United Kingdom after World War I, the government built a welfare state that promised healthcare, education, and a safety net for the poor. The architects of that system, such as William Beveridge, spoke in terms that sound very much like utilitarian language. Beveridge's famous report said that society should aim to make provision for the whole population, not just the fortunate few. The report listed 5 giant evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. By attacking each of those evils, the plan hoped to raise the total amount of happiness in the nation. The creation of the National Health Service in 1948 was a concrete step that followed that logic. It offered free medical care to everyone, no matter how much money they earned. The idea was that a healthier population would be more productive and would feel less suffering, which in turn would raise the overall level of well-being. A second historical example shows how numbers can be turned into policy tools. In the 1960s, the United States government began to use cost-benefit analysis in many areas, from highway construction to environmental regulation. The method asks, what is the expected benefit of a project, measured in dollars or in estimated lives saved? And what is the expected cost? If the benefit exceeds the cost, the project is approved. This approach grew out of the work of economists such as Kenneth Arrow and public policy scholars like Robert McNamara. Their reports often quoted the simple rule: spend the money where it does the most good. The language mirrors the utilitarian principle that the right action is the one that produces the greatest net happiness. Healthcare triage is a place where utilitarian thinking meets life and death choices. In an emergency room that is suddenly full, doctors must decide who gets immediate treatment and who must wait. The rule they follow is often called the greatest good for the greatest number. If 2 patients need a ventilator and only one is available, the team may choose the patient who has the best chance of survival and who can return to a life with many more years of happiness. The decision is guided by a calculation of likely outcomes, not by personal feelings about the patients. In the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, many hospitals published triage guidelines that used similar reasoning. The guidelines said that doctors should aim to save the most lives possible, even if that meant turning away some patients who might have lived longer under different circumstances. Business ethics also uses utilitarian ideas, especially when companies test the safety of their products. A classic case involves a car manufacturer that must decide how much testing to do before a new model reaches the market. The company can spend a lot of money on extra crash tests, which would lower the chance of accidents, but would also raise the price of the car. The utilitarian calculation weighs the benefit of fewer injuries against the cost of higher prices that might keep some buyers from purchasing the car. If the extra testing saves a few lives but makes the car too expensive for many families, the company may decide that the overall happiness would be higher by keeping the price lower and accepting a small risk. The decision is often justified with the words of John Stuart Mill. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. The company can point to that quote as a guide for balancing safety and affordability. Everyday life offers smaller, but still clear examples of utilitarian reasoning. One example is the choice of a recycling program in a neighborhood. The local council proposes two options: a single-stream system that lets residents toss all recyclables together, or a multi-stream system that requires sorting paper, plastic, glass, and metal into separate bins. The single-stream system is cheaper to run and easier for residents, so more people are likely to use it. However, it also produces more contamination, meaning that a larger share of the material ends up in landfills. The multi-stream system costs more and needs more effort from each household, but it yields cleaner material that can be turned into new products. The council must weigh the total benefit, the extra effort and cost versus the larger environmental gain. If the analysis shows that the cleaner stream saves enough energy and reduces enough pollution to outweigh the extra cost, the council may choose the multi-stream option. The decision follows the utilitarian rule of picking the plan that creates the most overall good. A second everyday illustration involves a small bakery that wants to test a new pastry recipe. The bakery could launch the pastry immediately, hoping that customers will love it and that sales will rise quickly. Or it could run a small tasting event, gather feedback, and adjust the recipe before a full launch. The tasting event costs time and money, and some customers may be disappointed if the pastry is not ready. The bakery must decide whether the short-term boost in sales is worth the possible negative reaction, or whether the longer-term benefit of a better product will bring more happiness to more customers. By applying a simple cost-benefit view, the bakery can choose the path that is likely to increase overall satisfaction. These stories show how utilitarian ideas move from theory to practice. Yet the approach is not without criticism. One common counterargument says that an over-reliance on numbers can hide what matters most to people. Numbers can count lives saved, dollars saved, or emissions reduced, but they can miss feelings of dignity, cultural identity, or personal attachment. For instance, a cost-benefit analysis of building a dam might show a large net gain in electricity and flood control. However, the dam could also flood a sacred valley that holds deep meaning for a local tribe. The tribe's loss of place and heritage may not be captured in a simple monetary tally. Critics argue that when decision-makers focus only on the numeric outcome, they risk ignoring values that cannot be easily measured. A second criticism focuses on the danger of short-term gains that damage long-term trust. In business, a company might cut safety testing to launch a product faster, hoping to capture market share and increase profits. The immediate benefit looks good on paper, but if a defect later causes injuries, the public's trust in the brand can fall sharply. The loss of trust can lead to lower sales for years, harming the very people the company originally tried to please. The same pattern can appear in public policy. A government might cut funding for a social program to balance the budget quickly, creating a short-term fiscal surplus. Yet the people who rely on that program may feel abandoned, and the political fallout can make it harder to pass future reforms that would improve overall happiness. These examples illustrate how focusing only on immediate numbers can create problems that outweigh the early benefits. The balance between numbers and human values is a theme that runs through the earlier discussion of measurement. Measurement can help compare different outcomes, but it is not the whole story. Justice, as discussed earlier, also matters. A decision that maximizes total happiness but leaves a vulnerable group worse off may feel unjust. Utilitarian thinkers have tried to address this by adding rules that protect minorities, or by using a rule-utilitarian approach that follows guidelines that usually lead to the best outcomes, rather than calculating each case anew. The examples above show how those ideas can be mixed with practical tools. To bring the ideas home, a simple analogy can be used. Imagine a gardener who wants the garden to look its best. The gardener can water every plant the same amount, or can spend extra time watering the flowers that need more water. If the gardener only counts the number of plants that survive, the best plan might be to give each plant just enough water to stay alive. But if the gardener also cares about the beauty of the blossoms, the extra effort on the flowers makes sense, even though it uses more water. The gardener's choice mirrors the utilitarian balance between the greatest total benefit and the special value of certain outcomes. Another analogy comes from cooking. A chef preparing a large pot of soup can add a pinch of salt to make the whole pot taste better. Adding too much salt could ruin the flavor for everyone. The chef must judge how much salt will improve the overall taste without harming any portion of the soup. This simple act reflects the utilitarian idea of adjusting an action to maximize the good for the most people. Real-world applications also appear in environmental policy. Many cities now use green budgeting, which adds the estimated health benefits of cleaner air to the financial calculations of a project. If a new bike lane reduces car traffic, the city counts the lower rates of asthma and heart disease as part of the benefit. By turning health outcomes into numbers, the city can compare the bike lane to other projects, such as a new parking garage. The decision that yields the highest combined score of money saved and health improved follows the utilitarian pattern. In education, school districts sometimes use utilitarian reasoning when they decide how to allocate resources. If a district has a limited amount of money for after-school programs, it may choose to fund a tutoring program that helps the most students improve their grades, rather than a niche arts program that serves fewer students. The choice aims to raise the overall academic achievement, which is linked to better future earnings and life satisfaction. Critics, however, point out that the arts also contribute to happiness in ways that are harder to measure. The debate shows how the tension between measurable outcomes and intangible benefits plays out in everyday settings. The healthcare triage example also connects to the earlier discussion of justice. In a triage system that follows a pure utilitarian rule, patients with the highest chance of survival get treatment first. This can seem unfair to a patient who is older or has a chronic illness, even if that patient has lived a full life. Some hospitals add a fairness adjustment, giving a small priority boost to those who have been waiting longer or who have dependents. This blend of utility and justice tries to keep the system both effective and perceived as fair. The UK welfare state story also shows how utilitarian ideas can be combined with a sense of rights. The post-war reforms were not just about numbers. They were also about giving every citizen a basic level of security. The belief was that a society that guarantees food, shelter, and health for all creates a foundation for greater happiness overall. The welfare state therefore reflects a mix of utilitarian calculation and a moral commitment to human dignity. The cost-benefit analysis method, while powerful, also demonstrates the limits of pure calculation. In the 1960s, when the method was first applied to environmental regulation, critics argued that putting a price on clean air ignored the deep love people have for nature. The debate led to the creation of non-market valuation techniques, which try to estimate how much people would be willing to pay for clean rivers or quiet parks. Even these techniques admit that some values are hard to capture, and that numbers must be used with caution. In business, the product safety test example can be linked to a famous quote from the philosopher Jeremy Bentham: "The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong." Bentham's idea was that the right action is the one that produces the most net pleasure. A company that tests its product thoroughly is following that rule, because it tries to avoid harm that would reduce overall happiness. Yet the company also has to consider the cost to consumers, which may affect how many people can afford the product. The balance between safety and price is a practical expression of Bentham's principle. John Stuart Mill added a nuance that helps answer the counter-argument about short-term gains. Mill wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." In other words, higher-order pleasures, such as trust, respect, and knowledge, matter more than simple, immediate pleasures. This idea supports the view that short-term financial gains should not be chosen over long-term trust. Companies that ignore this risk losing the deeper, more lasting form of happiness that comes from a good reputation. The practical section also includes a look at how technology uses utilitarian ideas. Online platforms often use algorithms that try to show users the content that will keep them engaged the longest. The goal is to maximize total watch time, which translates into more advertising revenue. This approach mirrors the utilitarian aim of creating the most benefit, in this case profit, for the most users. However, critics point out that focusing only on engagement can lead to the spread of misinformation or addictive designs, which hurt users' long-term well-being. The debate shows how a narrow focus on a single metric can overlook broader human values. In the field of disaster relief, agencies use utilitarian calculations to decide where to send aid first. After an earthquake, the team may assess which villages have the most survivors, the most severe injuries, and the fewest resources. By sending supplies to those areas, the agencies hope to reduce the total amount of suffering. The method is similar to triage in a hospital, but on a larger scale. The decision also reflects the earlier discussion of measurement, because data on casualties, infrastructure damage, and access routes are all turned into numbers that guide action. A final example comes from the world of sports. A city that wants to host a major event, such as the Olympics, must weigh the cost of building stadiums against the expected boost in tourism, civic pride, and future use of the facilities. The utilitarian analysis adds up the projected revenue, the number of jobs created, and the enjoyment of local fans. If the total projected benefit exceeds the cost, the city may go ahead with the bid. Yet many critics point to cases where the promised benefits never materialized, leaving the city with debt and unused venues. The lesson is that numbers must be realistic, and that intangible costs, such as community disruption, should also be considered. Through all these cases, a pattern emerges. Utilitarian ideas encourage decision-makers to think about the total impact of their actions, to try to count both benefits and harms, and to aim for the greatest net good. The method works well when outcomes can be measured, when the data are reliable, and when the values at stake are mostly material. When the stakes include deep personal values, cultural meanings, or long-term trust, the simple calculation can miss important parts of the picture. The two counter-arguments presented earlier remind listeners that numbers are tools, not substitutes for moral judgment. A reliance on numbers can hide the human side of a problem, and focusing on short-term gains can erode the very trust that makes societies function. The earlier sections on measurement and justice showed that a balanced approach is needed. Measurement helps compare options, while justice ensures that the rights and dignity of individuals are respected. In closing, the practical world of policy, health, and business offers many illustrations of utilitarian thinking in action, from the creation of a national welfare system to the modern use of cost-benefit analysis, from the choice of a recycling program to the safety testing of a new product. The guiding idea remains the same. Try to bring the most happiness to the most people. At the same time, the stories of floods that drown sacred lands, of shortcuts that break trust, and of decisions that ignore deep values show why the simple formula must be tempered with care, compassion, and a sense of fairness. The balance between numbers and human worth is the real art of applying utilitarian philosophy to everyday life. The modern chapter of utilitarian thought begins with a simple question. How should the old idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number be updated for a world that knows more about desire, suffering, and the planet? In the early days of the theory, Jeremy Bentham talked about pleasure and pain as the only things that matter. John Stuart Mill added the idea of higher and lower pleasures. Those ideas still hold a place in the story, but later thinkers have tried to sharpen the picture. Two of the most talked about updates are preference utilitarianism and negative utilitarianism. Both keep the core belief that actions are right when they bring about the best overall outcome, but each looks at the outcome in a different way. Preference utilitarianism says that the right thing to do is the one that fulfills the most informed preferences. A preference is simply what a person wants. If a person prefers to eat a meal that does not hurt any animal, and that preference is sincere and informed, then making that meal possible adds to the overall good. R.M. Hare, a British philosopher, wrote that the principle of utility is the ultimate moral principle because it is the only principle that can be applied to all persons equally. Hare's version of preference utilitarianism asks each person to think about what they truly want, not just what they feel at the moment. Peter Singer, a contemporary ethicist, took the same idea and applied it to the lives of animals. Singer famously wrote, "The only thing that counts morally is the capacity to suffer." And he added that the preferences of sentient beings count just as much as human preferences when we count overall good. To see how this works in daily life, imagine a person who is choosing a diet. The person learns that factory farms cause a lot of suffering for chickens, cows, and pigs. The person also learns that a plant-based diet can provide the same nutrition without causing that suffering. The person's informed preference may shift toward a diet that avoids animal products. Preference utilitarianism would say that choosing the plant-based diet is the right move, because it lines up with the person's updated desire to reduce animal suffering, and because many other people share that same desire. The total amount of satisfied preferences goes up, and the overall good rises. A second scenario shows how preference utilitarianism can shape political choices. A voter is faced with a decision about a climate policy that will cut carbon emissions but will also raise taxes. The voter learns that the policy will likely prevent future heat waves, floods, and food shortages that would cause great distress for millions of people. The voter also learns that the tax increase will affect their own household budget. The voter's informed preference may be to support the policy, because the desire to avoid large-scale suffering outweighs the personal inconvenience. Preference utilitarianism would count that vote as a good choice, because it helps satisfy the many preferences of people who want a safer climate, while still respecting the voters' own informed wish to protect their family's finances. Even with these clear examples, preference utilitarianism faces a strong counter-argument. Not all preferences are based on good information. A person might prefer to eat a certain type of meat because they have never heard about the conditions in which the animal was raised. Or a person might prefer to stay home instead of voting because they think their vote does not matter. If a preference is built on false or incomplete facts, then satisfying it could actually lower the overall good. Critics say that the theory must first check whether a preference is well informed before it can be counted. Hare himself warned that the satisfaction of a mistaken desire does not add to the sum of happiness. The challenge, then, is to create a system that helps people form accurate preferences before those preferences are used to measure moral value. Negative utilitarianism offers a different twist on the old idea. Instead of trying to add up all the pleasure and preference satisfaction, negative utilitarianism focuses on reducing suffering as the main goal. The thought is simple. Pain is harder to live with than pleasure is to enjoy, so the moral priority should be to cut down on pain as much as possible. Some philosophers, such as R.M. Hare in his later work, have suggested that the worst part of life is the amount of suffering that exists, and that a moral theory should aim first to make that number as low as it can go. A practical illustration of negative utilitarianism can be seen in the same climate policy vote. The voter might think, if this policy stops a future flood that would drown a whole town, then it prevents a huge amount of pain. Even if the policy brings some small inconvenience, the negative utilitarian view would still say the vote is right because the main effect is the reduction of future suffering. In this view, the positive side effects, like cleaner air or new jobs, are nice, but they are not the core reason for the decision. The focus stays on the removal of a possible source of great pain. A second example comes from healthcare. A hospital can choose to spend its budget on a program that gives a small boost to the comfort of many patients, or it can spend the same money on a program that prevents a serious disease in a few patients. Negative utilitarianism would say that preventing the disease, which would cause a lot of pain, is the better choice, even if fewer people benefit overall. The theory tells decision-makers to look first at what harms can be stopped. Negative utilitarianism also meets a serious objection. By putting the reduction of pain above everything else, it may ignore the value of positive experiences. A life that has no pain but also no joy could be seen as a failure by many people. Critics argue that a theory that only looks at suffering might support extreme actions, like ending a life that is merely mildly unhappy, because it would remove that pain. The philosopher Karl Popper warned that a society that only seeks to avoid pain may miss the point of what makes life worth living. The counter-argument says that a balanced view must keep space for happiness, not just the absence of suffering. Both modern variants grew out of historical movements that changed how people think about animals and the environment. In the early 1970s, a wave of animal rights activism began to spread across the English-speaking world. The publication of Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, in 1975 sparked heated debate in universities and newspapers. Singer's argument that the capacity to suffer gives animals moral consideration helped turn the animal rights movement into a serious philosophical discussion. The movement gave preference utilitarianism a new arena, because it asked people to think about the preferences of non-human beings and to adjust their habits accordingly. At the same time, the 1970s saw the birth of modern environmental ethics. The first Earth Day in 1970 brought millions of people together to protest pollution and to call for a cleaner planet. Aldo Leopold, Serene Ethic, published a few years earlier, argued that humans should see themselves as part of a larger community that includes soils, waters, plants, and animals. This idea helped shape a new kind of moral thinking that looks at the well-being of ecosystems, not just individuals. The rise of environmental ethics gave negative utilitarianism a fresh context, because the biggest harms of climate change are often expressed as large-scale suffering for both people and animals. These historical moments also produced vivid anecdotes that help illustrate the shift. One story tells of a group of students at a university in the mid-1970s who staged a protest by chaining themselves to a slaughterhouse gate. Their goal was to make the public see the hidden pain of animals in industrial farms. The protest received national coverage, and soon after, many grocery stores began labeling meat as humanely raised. The anecdote shows how a moral idea can move from a classroom discussion to a real-world change that aligns with preference utilitarian thinking. Another anecdote comes from the first Earth Day rally in Washington, D.C. A young activist handed a microphone to a retired farmer who spoke about how drought had destroyed his crops and left his family without food. The farmer's story put a human face on the abstract idea of environmental harm. The crowd responded by voting for new clean air laws. This moment illustrates how negative utilitarian concerns about large-scale suffering can turn into concrete policy action. Modern philosophers have taken these ideas even further. Effective altruism, a movement that grew out of preference utilitarianism, encourages people to use data and reason to find the most effective ways to help others. The movement often cites Singer's work on animal welfare and his claim that the interests of all beings count equally. In practice, effective altruists might donate to charities that reduce animal suffering, because they see that as a way to satisfy many preferences with a small amount of money. On the negative side, some thinkers have tried to blend negative utilitarianism with a concern for positive experiences. They propose a balanced utilitarianism that first makes sure suffering is kept low, then adds happiness where possible. This approach tries to answer the criticism that a pure focus on pain could lead to a dull, joyless world. It also respects the original utilitarian aim of maximizing overall good, while keeping the urgent need to cut down on severe harm. When the ideas are put into everyday choices, the picture becomes clearer. Imagine a person who is deciding whether to buy a pair of shoes made from leather. A preference utilitarian would ask, does the buyer truly want the leather shoes, knowing the animal suffering involved? If the buyer learns about the conditions and changes their mind, then buying a synthetic shoe satisfies a more informed preference and adds to overall good. A negative utilitarian would look at the same decision and ask, does buying the leather shoes add to suffering? If the answer is yes, then the better choice is the synthetic shoe, because it avoids that extra pain. A second everyday decision involves voting on a local measure to fund a new public transit line. The measure would reduce traffic, lower air pollution, and make commuting easier for many people. Preference utilitarianism would count the many people who prefer cleaner air and faster travel, and would see the vote as a good one if those preferences are well informed. Negative utilitarianism would focus on the reduction of future health problems caused by pollution, seeing the measure as a way to cut down on suffering for future generations. Both modern variants also have practical tools that help people apply them. Preference surveys, for example, can be used by governments to gauge what citizens truly want after they have been given clear information. Negative impact assessments are used by companies to estimate how much pain a new project might cause, and then to try to lower that number. These tools show that the old idea of greatest happiness can be turned into concrete steps that affect policy, business, and personal life. The core of utilitarian thought remains the same. Actions are judged by how they affect the well-being of those involved. Preference utilitarianism adds a layer of what people want, while negative utilitarianism adds a layer of what hurts the most. Both layers try to make the original principle more precise for a world that knows more about desire, suffering, and the planet. By looking at the two scenarios of diet choice and climate voting, the modern variants show how the old idea can guide real decisions that shape daily life and global policy. In the end, the story of modern utilitarianism is a story of adaptation. It started with the simple notion that pleasure and pain matter, and it has grown to include the wishes of sentient beings and the urgent need to stop large-scale harm. The thinkers who have shaped this path, from R.M. Hare to Peter Singer, have offered tools that help people think clearly about what they value and what they should avoid. The historical moments of animal rights protests and the first Earth Day remind us that ideas can move from the page to the streets, and from the streets to the ballot box. The practical takeaway for anyone listening is clear. When faced with a choice, ask first whether the preference behind the choice is based on good information. Then ask whether the choice reduces suffering, and finally ask whether it adds positive experiences. By following that simple three-step check, the old wisdom of utilitarianism can still guide modern life, whether the decision is about what to eat, how to vote, or how to spend a few dollars on charity. The calm, reflective approach of this philosophy invites each person to think a little deeper, to listen to the voices of all who are affected, and to act in a way that makes the world a little better for everyone. The story of utilitarian thought has always been a story about measuring what matters, about weighing pleasure against pain, and about trying to turn moral choices into something that can be counted. In the first part of the video, the narrator explained how Bentham tried to write a hedonic calculus that listed 7 factors: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent, as a way to add up happiness. The narrator then showed how Mill added a quality test, how modern versions have turned the idea toward preferences and capabilities, and how today many people use numbers, surveys, and experiments to guess what makes life better. All of those ideas point to a single question that still feels fresh. How can the greatest good principle work in a world where computers can crunch numbers faster than any human mind? The next chapter looks ahead. It asks what will happen when the tools that measure utility become as powerful as the ideas that first inspired them. It asks how AI and data science might reshape the way we think about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It also asks how a calm, reflective mind can stay aware of the limits of those tools. The following words walk through the history, the present, and the possible future, while keeping the tone gentle and the language plain. From early computer worries to big data health work, the first hint that machines could change moral thinking came in the late 1960s, when a group of engineers and philosophers met at a conference called the Conference on Computer Ethics. One of the speakers, a young computer scientist named Joseph Weizenbaum, later wrote a short story about a program called Elisa that pretended to be a therapist. He warned that people might start trusting a computer to give advice about feelings, even though the program only reflected words back. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "When a machine pretends to understand, the user may surrender his own judgment." That warning was an early echo of the utilitarian worry about losing the human sense of what feels good or bad. A second historical moment shows how data can be turned into public health action. In 1994, the city of Chicago used a new system that linked hospital records, pharmacy sales, and school absenteeism reports to spot a spike in asthma attacks. The data showed that a particular industrial area was releasing pollutants on certain days. City officials used that information to change traffic patterns and to warn residents. The effort was praised as a triumph of evidence-based policy. But it also raised a question that Bentham would have liked. If numbers can tell us where the most pain occurs, who decides what to do with that knowledge? The episode became a classic example of how big data can help reduce suffering, a goal that sits at the heart of utilitarianism. Algorithmic decision-making in modern thinkers. Fast forward to today, and the conversation has moved from small city projects to global platforms. A handful of thinkers have taken up the challenge of fitting utilitarian ideas into the world of algorithms. One of them is Nick Bostrom, a philosopher who studies the long-term impact of technology. He often writes about instrumental convergence, the idea that many intelligent systems, no matter how they start, will try to achieve goals that maximize some measure of success. Bostrom suggests that if that measure is set up as a proxy for human well-being, the system could act like a giant utilitarian calculator. Another voice comes from Cathy O'Neill, a data scientist who wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction. She warns that when an algorithm is used to allocate resources, for example, to decide which schools get extra funding or which patients receive faster appointments, the hidden assumptions inside the code can turn a well-intended greatest goal into a source of unfairness. She quotes the ancient saying, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," to remind readers that numbers alone cannot guarantee moral outcomes. A third contributor, William MacAskill, works on effective altruism, a movement that tries to apply utilitarian reasoning to charitable giving. He has begun to explore how AI can help donors choose the most effective charities by modeling long-term outcomes. In a recent interview, he said, "If a computer can predict that $1 spent on a malaria net saves more lives than $1 spent on a museum exhibit, then the rational choice is clear." MacAskill's view shows how modern utilitarianism can be paired with data to guide everyday decisions. Two everyday examples, a smart home and a learning app. To see how these ideas play out in daily life, imagine a smart thermostat that learns when a family is home, when they like the temperature a little cooler, and when the electricity grid is most expensive. The device runs an algorithm that balances comfort against cost and environmental impact. It calculates, in real time, the small amount of extra heat that would make the living room feel nicer for the kids, against the extra carbon that would be released by the power plant. The thermostat then decides to turn the heat down a degree during a short window, saving a few dollars and a few grams of CO, while still keeping the family comfortable. The decision follows a utilitarian pattern. It tries to maximize overall well-being, comfort plus environmental health, while minimizing pain, higher bills, colder rooms. A second example is a personalized learning app used by a middle school student. The app tracks which math problems the student solves quickly, which concepts cause hesitation, and how long the student stays focused. Using that data, the app offers a slightly easier problem set when frustration rises, and a more challenging set when confidence is high. The goal is to keep the student in a zone of proximal development, a sweet spot where learning feels rewarding rather than stressful. By measuring engagement, the app aims to produce the greatest amount of learning pleasure for the greatest number of study minutes. The app's algorithm acts as a small-scale utilitarian planner, constantly weighing short-term effort against long-term satisfaction. Both examples show how the core idea of adding up benefits and costs can be built into devices that sit on a kitchen counter or a child's tablet. They also show how the measurement tools that philosophers once tried to write by hand are now embedded in code, connecting back to measurement and modern variants. Earlier in the series, the narrator described how modern utilitarians have moved from Bentham's simple arithmetic to more sophisticated models. Preference utilitarianism, for example, says that what matters is not just pleasure, but the satisfaction of each person's preferences. Rule utilitarianism says that instead of looking at each act, one should adopt rules that, if followed by everyone, would bring the most happiness. These ideas already rely on a kind of data. Surveys of preferences, statistical studies of rule outcomes, and experiments that test how people feel after certain policies. The smart home thermostat and the learning app are direct descendants of those modern variants. The thermostat follows a rule-like approach: keep temperature within a comfort band unless the grid price spikes. The learning app follows a preference-based approach: adjust difficulty to match the learner's current desire for challenge. Both rely on continuous measurement, temperature sensors, energy price feeds, clickstream data, response times to update their calculations. In this way, the new technology is a living illustration of the measurement ideas discussed earlier. Two counter-arguments: algorithm bias and loss of human judgment. Even as these tools seem to bring the greatest good calculus to the home, critics raise two powerful concerns. The first concern is algorithm bias. When an algorithm decides how to allocate resources, it does so based on the data it has been given. If that data reflects past inequalities, the algorithm may repeat them. For instance, a city might use an AI system to decide where to place new electric car charging stations. If the training data shows that wealthier neighborhoods already have more chargers, the algorithm could suggest adding even more there, leaving low-income areas underserved. The bias is not a mistake. It is built into the numbers. Cathy O'Neill writes, "When a model is fed biased data, the output is a mirror of that bias, not a neutral truth." From a utilitarian perspective, the bias reduces overall happiness because a portion of the population continues to suffer from lack of access. The second concern is the loss of human judgment. Utilitarianism asks people to consider the feelings of others, to empathize, and to reflect on the broader picture. When a machine makes the calculation, that reflective step can disappear. A hospital might use an AI system to decide which patients receive a limited supply of a new drug. The algorithm could rank patients by projected survival rates, but it would not consider a patient's personal story, family responsibilities, or a sudden change in condition. A doctor who follows the algorithm without question may feel that the decision is cold, that it reduces a human being to a number. The philosopher John Rawls, though not a utilitarian, warned that justice is not a matter of calculation alone. The warning applies here. If the calculation replaces moral imagination, the result may be efficient but not truly humane. Both counter-arguments remind the audience that the greatest good formula is not a magic wand. It works only when the data is fair, and when people keep a watchful eye on the outcomes. Future directions: AI, data, and the evolving utilitarian project. Looking ahead, several trends suggest how utilitarian thinking might grow with technology. First, the rise of causal inference in data science gives a way to see not just correlation, but cause and effect. If an algorithm can estimate how a policy will change well-being, it can make more accurate predictions about utility. Researchers like Judea Pearl have shown that causal models can help answer what-if questions. A future utilitarian planner could run a simulation that asks, what if the city subsidizes solar panels for low-income homes? The model would estimate the reduction in electricity bills, the drop in emissions, and the increase in health outcomes, then add those numbers together. The result would be a clearer picture of the total happiness gained. Second, the growth of reinforcement learning allows machines to learn from trial and error, adjusting their actions to maximize a reward signal. If the reward signal is designed to reflect human well-being, perhaps by combining survey data, health metrics, and environmental indicators, the AI could learn policies that continuously improve overall utility. Researchers at DeepMind have already used reinforcement learning to reduce energy use in data centers by 40%, an achievement that directly aligns with a utilitarian goal of reducing waste. Third, the concept of human in the loop is becoming central. Instead of handing over decisions completely, designers are building systems where a human can override or adjust the algorithm's suggestion. In the smart home example, the family can set a comfort priority that tells the thermostat to keep the house warmer even if the grid price is high. In the learning app, a teacher can flag a lesson as essential and force the app to keep it challenging, even if the student's engagement dips. These loops keep the reflective element of utilitarianism alive. Fourth, the field of algorithmic fairness is producing tools that test for bias before a system is deployed. Techniques such as counterfactual testing ask, if the same person had a different race or gender, would the algorithm treat them the same? By incorporating these checks, developers can reduce the risk of unfair outcomes, moving the system closer to the utilitarian aim of maximizing happiness for everyone, not just the majority. Finally, the philosophical community is expanding the definition of utility itself. Some scholars argue that digital well-being, the feeling of being in control of one's online life, should count as a component of happiness. Others suggest that intergenerational utility, the impact on future generations, must be measured in any modern calculus. These ideas push the horizon of utilitarian measurement beyond the immediate pleasure-pain balance to include long-term and digital dimensions. Personal reflection in a calm voice. The narrator does not claim to have a final answer. Instead, the story invites the listener to think about how the old idea of adding up happiness can live in a world of smart devices and massive datasets. It asks the listener to picture a future where a thermostat, a learning app, and a health policy all try to do the right thing, but where a human still watches, questions, and steps in when needed. A gentle reminder comes from Bentham himself, who wrote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure." That sentence still rings true, even when the masters are expressed as numbers on a screen. The challenge is to keep the sense that the numbers are tools, not masters. When a city uses AI to decide where to plant trees, the goal should be to bring shade, cleaner air, and joy to the people who walk under those trees. When a school uses a learning app, the goal should be to spark curiosity, not just to increase test scores. The reflection also brings back Mill's warning. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs. In a world where algorithms can nudge choices, the freedom to decide remains essential. The listener is invited to ask, do I feel comfortable letting a program choose my thermostat settings? Do I trust a learning app to decide how hard my child's homework should be? The answers will differ for each person, and that diversity is part of the utilitarian picture. The greatest happiness is not a single number, but a chorus of many voices. Quotes that tie the past to the future, Bentham's own words still echo. The greatest happiness principle is the foundation of morality. The principle remains the same, even if the way it is measured has changed. John Stuart Mill added, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. In the age of AI, the phrase tend to promote becomes a statistical prediction, but the moral direction stays clear. From the modern side, Nick Bostrom wrote, if an AI system can reliably predict human welfare, it becomes a powerful instrument for utilitarian policy. The quote captures the hope that better prediction can help the greatest good goal. Cathy O'Neill warned, algorithms are opinions embedded in code. The reminder that a model reflects the values of its creator is a call to keep the moral conversation alive. A closing picture, imagine a city in 2035 where every streetlight, every bus route, and every public park is guided by an algorithm that constantly checks a dashboard of well-being indicators, air quality, noise levels, citizen satisfaction surveys, and health statistics. The system suggests that a new bike lane will reduce traffic accidents, lower emissions, and increase exercise, raising the overall happiness score. The City Council reviews the suggestion, holds a public meeting, and decides to add the lane, while also listening to a small group that worries about safety for cyclists with disabilities. The final plan includes extra lighting and a ramp, showing that human judgment added nuance to the raw calculation. In a nearby home, a family watches the smart thermostat lower the heat a few degrees during the night, saving energy and money. The mother notices that her son sleeps better with a cooler room, and she manually adjusts the setting for a few nights to find the sweet spot. The thermostat learns from her tweaks, and later suggests a schedule that matches the family's rhythm, blending algorithmic advice with personal experience. These scenes illustrate a future where utilitarian ideas are alive in everyday tools, but where people still have the power to shape the outcomes. The greatest good principle does not disappear. It simply finds new ways to be measured, debated, and applied. Final thought. The story of utilitarianism is a story of trying to count happiness, of learning from mistakes, and of reaching for a world where fewer people suffer. As AI and data grow stronger, the story gains new chapters. The tools become sharper, the measurements more precise, and the possibilities wider. Yet the same old warnings stay relevant. Bias can hide in data, and a cold calculation can forget the warmth of human feeling. The calm voice of the narrator leaves the listener with a simple invitation. Keep watching the numbers, keep asking the questions, and keep remembering that the goal is not just a higher score, but a life that feels better for as many people as possible.